All right, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our August 2021 Small Ruminant Lunch and Learn with our Small Ruminant team members. So my name is Elysia Rodgers, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Educator for Purdue Extension in DeKalb County. Coming to you today from our Northeast Purdue Ag Center. We've got a field day going on today, so trying to do double duty. So also with me today, we have Matthias Ingle. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Matthias.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Matthias Ingle. I am also an Ag and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Howard County. So Kokomo, Indiana is where I'm located at. I've been here about 2.5 years. I am not doing double duty today, but our field day was yesterday. So, but I'm happy to be here with you guys and hopefully teach you a little bit about reestablishing some pastures.
All right, thank you, Matthias. So as Matthias said, our topic for today is kind of reestablishment of pastures. So this is a presentation I actually put together a few months ago for another talk, but it has some great information that we'll be sharing today. So we called it kind of the reestablishment of pastures, just because establishment and reestablishment are fairly similar in terms of how we need to go about it. So next slide, please, Matthias. All right, so when we look at our pastures, ideally, which would you prefer to see? Would you like to see something like this? Nice and thistly, all the way shortened to the ground, things like that? Or would you rather have something like this? It's going to be lush, green, the animals are grazing through it. We're not seeing a lot of undesirable weeds, we'll put them that way. Things like that. So those are some things just kind of think of and put in the back of your mind. Which would you prefer to see? And it'll kind of lead into how we get things established and reestablished in our pastures and hay ground. Next. All right, so to begin, basically our method used for establishing perennial forages can make the difference between a long-lived stand and a poor long-lived stand. So making sure we have the right methods down when that seed, even before that seed goes in the ground, we need to get things set before that seed even goes into the ground. So, right. So in order to have a uniform stand, so something that's going to be basically broad across the board, nice green, good growth. We aren't seeing a lot of holes where weeds and things like that can come through. You basically have your uniform stand. You have your adequate number of plants, so you're not overseeding or underseeding. And that will basically create our maximum yield. So how many plants can be supported by your soil, by what you have in the ground for those plants to grow. And in turn, how many plants can grow and how much mass you can get in those plants for your animals to eat. Go ahead. All right, so obviously, like we said before, we need our appropriate seeding rate. And so there's on your seed tags, when seeds are planted, it tells you how many pounds per acre you need to plant. So you'll need to calibrate your drill to make sure that you get the right amount of seedings. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. You also need to have the right amount of fertilization. So making sure you do your soil tests ahead of time. Know what's in the ground. Know what your seeds need, your plants need to survive. Because your soil may say one thing, but your plants may need completely different fertilization. So basically having those good seeding rates, good fertilizer for your plants to get going, basically kind of helps maximize our odds for that establishment success. Next. All right, so these are kind of a few questions to ask yourself when you're looking at kind of pasture management situations. So what are you doing and what can be done better? So are you soil testing on a fairly regular basis and understand and fertilize based on those results? Do you know your major soil types? Know their strengths, know their weaknesses? Have you looked at Web Soil Survey to see what soils are actually on your farm, to see if they actually are good for plant growth or not? So Web Soil Survey is a great online tool. Do you know what forages you currently have in your pasture or pasture area? Are they suitable for the livestock you want to grow? So in this case, our small ruminants, or are they just not preferred for the small ruminants? Are you practicing kind of some rotational grazing? So making sure that our pastures, forage species are getting a rest every once in a while, that they aren't being completely grazed down to absolutely nothing like we saw in those first pictures, because plants need time to regrow. They need that energy. It's kind of like us. If we kind of keep going and going and going, we need that break every once in a while to re-energize and recharge. And then are you stockpiling any perennial pastures to possibly be able to graze through the winter? Are some other considerations. Next. All right. Are you looking at your pasture growth, going out there and not just doing kind of that 55-mile-per-hour drive-by saying, yep, it looks green, it looks good, we're good to go? Are you actually going out and evaluating what your pasture looks like, looking at that pasture stand? Are you starting to get some holes here and there? Are you starting to get some weeds? So going out there and actually walking your pastures and making sure that you know and see what's growing and going on in your pastures. Making sure record keeping is always important for any aspect of livestock husbandry, whether you're looking at making sure you're recording when you move your animals onto new pasture, or maybe when you did a new seeding, so you know when you can move those animals on there so you have good root growth. Even documenting when rain and drought events take place, so that way you know if there's excess rain or excess moisture in that ground, maybe keeping those animals off and putting them on a sacrifice lot, things like that. And then where possible and applicable, are you kind of maybe working with a neighbor or potential on your farm where you might be able to kind of double crop, maybe some cover crops for some rotational grazing later on in the year? Where maybe the local farmer has a wheat field right next to you. Maybe you can do some temporary fencing around it and put some cover crops in there to provide some more green pasture for you later on. And then are you looking at kind of the nutrient composition of my hay? Because it is important to know what it is we're feeding our animals, whether it's fresh pasture or hay that they're getting as well. So making sure you're getting those forage tests done on the hay, so you know what it's made of to make sure your animals are getting all the nutrients that they need. And then do you have an agronomist on my list of professionals? So not everybody works with local elevators, things like that, but it is important to have somebody that you can call or email to talk to about questions you might have about your pastures, your hay fields. Someone that understands maybe what those soil tests are saying, what are the forage tests saying. So it's important to have somebody on kind of your call list when you're looking at really getting in depth and being able to properly manage your pastures and hay fields. All right, next. All right, so we'll briefly mention species and site selection, just because we have done a talk on this in the past. So you can go back to the YouTube channel and check that out if you'd like to, but we'll just mention a few things real quick. All right. All right, so again, kind of what are some of our questions to consider? Biggest thing, what's your end goal? What is it that you want your forage species to accomplish for you? Are you going to make primarily hay? Are you going to try to do rotational grazing year round? And then what species are you having on the pasture? So small ruminants, sheep and goats. Sheep are different grazers than what goats are. Goats prefer to browse. They prefer kind of more of our forbs, maybe some more woody species, things like that, versus goat or sheep that like to have kind of more of the grass-based grazing. So what's your end goal? What is it that you want your species to do for you? All right. And then again, what type of soil do you have? Again, depending on the soil, that says a lot in terms of things like pH, water holding capacity. things like that. So is it a soil that normally has a lower pH, maybe it's a little wetter, or a higher pH, maybe it's a little drier. So that will definitely determine what types of species we can plant there, because some plants like a lower pH, some like a higher pH, some prefer wetter soils, some prefer drier. So we need to know what that soil is that we're going to be putting that seed into. All right, and then again, what do you want out of your plant species and your livestock species? So like we said, just making sure you know what your end goal is. What is it that you want your plants to do for you? And what is it that you want your goats or sheep to do for you as well? Okay. And then, do you have a market for excess forage? This was one question I had during grad school, during kind of my thesis completion, that one of my advisors had asked me. He's like, okay, you've got a 40-acre field. It's starting to get a little ahead of you. What can you do? It should have been a simple answer. I could not think of it. So do you have a market for somebody nearby to make hay if your pastures start to get ahead of you? Or do you have the possibility to make the hay yourself? Things like that. Because some years may be great growing years where you don't have enough animals to keep ahead of your grass species or your forage species. So you may start getting to the point where you might need to make some hay just to get those pastures cut down. So things like that to think of. Okay. And then again, choosing your species variety. So you want to make sure when you're looking at something like alfalfa, or basically any sort of seed, you want to make sure that it's certified and that you have a high pure live seed percentage. Now, what the pure live seed means is that in that bag of seed, you have a high percentage of seed that is live, meaning it should germinate, and that is not weedy. So those are things to consider when you're looking at your pure live seed percentage. Okay. All right, and then in the case of legumes or grasses, it's important to select a variety, again, like we said, adapted to your area. So knowing what your soil is can really help shift and kind of change maybe your focus of what species you want. If you really have done some research and you're looking and you really like this one type of maybe a tall fescue, an endophyte-free variety, you think it looks great and things like that, you look at kind of what kind of the pH level needs, the soil, water needs, things like that. And then you go to Web Soil Survey and see that your soil is not best suited for it, you might have to change your plans. Okay. And then also look at university studies to see which species perform best in your area. Many of our land grant universities across the US have agronomy departments. And usually in those agronomy departments, many of them have forage focuses. So usually there's quite a few universities that perform studies year-round, looking at different types of seeds, how they compare to each other. Companies basically send in their types of seed and the universities test them for it. So it's an interesting thing to look at and see. Okay. All right, I'll let you take it over from here, Matthias.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some establishment preparations. So when we start thinking about establishment preparations, there's a couple different ways that we can go about this, and we'll get into about two different ways here coming up in the presentation of either establishing or renovating your current pastures. So the first way is seedbed establishment preparation. So I like to think of this as more of rip everything up and start all over. You're going to work the ground in order to plant the desired species of grasses or forages that you want in your pasture. One of the ways of doing this is prepare the seedbed as if you were preparing it for a cornfield. Then go over the field once more. It may take a cultipacker or a roller or something like that to kind of get that seedbed firmed up before you go out and plant. But but you want it to be nice and soft, but yet not too soft to where it's like you're walking on clouds. You want your foot to sink in just a little bit, but not so much there. So, and like it says here on the slide, when walking across a seed bed, your foot should sink or should not sink in more than about 1 inch. If it goes more than that, you've overworked the ground and you've got way too much preparation done. If your field is overworked, a crust may form after the rain and prevent the seedling emergence. So that's really not good at all. And depending on what your equipment needs are or tractors that you have access to, you also might want to think about talking to a farmer to work the ground for you. If you don't do it very often, it may not be worth your time or effort to go out and purchase equipment for a job that you may only have to do once. You may talk to your local equipment dealership to see about the potential to rent equipment, but it's usually a better idea to go talk to a neighboring farmer. And another thing is you may want to, Elysia mentioned a soil test. You also want to fertilize to these soil test numbers that you've got. So you want, when applying lime to bring down the pH to acidic, you want to make sure that lime is applied 6 months before planting. And then also provide adequate time for root establishment before grazing or harvesting. There's nothing worse than you get everything up and you start going and then you turn all the animals loose, and then pretty much the stand that you work so hard to accomplish pretty much goes to pot because you release the animals out on it too quickly. You're basically doing a lot of work for a whole lot of nothing. The next one is reestablishment or renovation. So what we like to think about here is you're taking what you have already and trying to make it better. This can be done through broadcast the seed before the green up occurs in the spring. And you can also cut and graze the original stand to the point that you think most seed where you can go out and basically broadcast the seed to reach the soil surface. Another thing is, before doing this, has your soil been tested? Do you have your pH numbers? Do you have your phosphorus? Do you have your potassium numbers? Ideally, you want your pH to be above 6.2, and your nitrogen and your phosphorus and your potassium at a high level. That way, you can get as much plant optimization as possible. When doing this, though, something to consider is you might want to drag the field with a harrow after or as you seed or as the seed is being broadcast. What this allows is just to kind of break up the surface of the soil. That way those seeds can kind of get down in there and you have a little bit better seed to soil contact that way. Another thing is you also want to reduce the competition of the young seedlings by grazing with livestock in the early spring or mechanically harvest a portion of the pasture as hay in May. So in this chart here, depending on the makeup of what your forages that you want to plant is, you may need to have slightly different pH levels for optimal growth. According to this chart, just about anything and everything will grow. Looks like in that 6.75 to 7.25 range. So after you have a soil test done, you find out your soil test or your soil is about 6.4. You may want to stay away from some of those least acid tolerant plants like the alfalfa, the sweet clover, the barley, and kind of focus more towards that center graph there. Your corn, sorghum, your grasses, your oats, rye, and wheat. You can look at the top ones, but you want to make in the soil to make sure your pH is right before trying to plant some of the other stuff. So with this, the seed preparation, your legume seeds must be inoculated with the proper ribosomium bacteria to ensure maximum nitrogen fixation. So with this, you want to make sure that if you're planting alfalfa, alfalfa can maximize nitrogen fixation, and with that, you want to have sometimes a secondary or a third legume to go along with that. Coated seed may be purchased which contains ribosome bacteria. And along with this, you also want to make sure you have the proper fertilization as well. A complete soil test should be taken from the area to be seeded 6 months to a year in advance of seeding. So you want to plan ahead and make sure that you know exactly what you're doing. If the soil pH is low and lime is needed, it should be worked into the soil at least 6 months in advance of seeding. And phosphorus and potassium must be applied to meet the soil test recommendations. So if nothing else from this presentation, I want to emphasize how important a soil sample or soil testing can be. Purdue Extension does have a publication titled HO-71 that you can use as a reference. You can contact your local extension office and they should be able to help you out and get you a copy of that. Or there's also several videos that some of our colleagues have put out there based around this HO-71 publication that you can go look up, or contact your local extension office and they should be able to help you find that video as well. I will turn it back over to Elysia here.
All right, thank you, Matthias. So when we're looking at planting, there's a few different methods, a few different tools, things like that we can look at. All right. So basically our timing of seeding. So right now, if you're in northern Indiana, or basically what we consider kind of above Indy, right now you're actually just about getting out of that window for the late summer seeding time frame. Really what you want to do is give your plants enough time to germinate, to get those roots established, to get good growth, good photosynthesis going for energy storage in those roots before it's first frozen. So usually you want about 6 to 8 weeks of basically growth before it gets a heavy frost on it the first time. So right now we're about out of that window for northern Indiana at least. Now southern Indiana, you can plant through about September 1st. So really about Labor Day weekend is about the latest you'll want to plant in southern Indiana. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Yep. So you need about 6 weeks of growth before the first killing frost. Now what we mean by growth is basically that seed has germinated and you have green above the ground is what we consider growth. It's not the time frame from when that seed goes into the ground. It's from that time that plant actually starts photosynthesizing, collecting that sun and creating and storing that energy. All right. We can also do spring seedings kind of early to mid-April, as long as the soil is dried enough. I know for us up here in northern Indiana, this spring wasn't as bad, but the last few years, 2019 especially, that soil would not dry out. We had farmers that were still planting corn and beans into July. So a year like that would not be a good year trying to get a new pasture or hayfield seeded early in the year. You can also do broadcast seeding. Go to the next slide, see if I have that before I start talking about it. There we go. All right. So legumes such as red clover, especially, can be successfully broadcast seeded in February and early March before the frost is out of the ground. And basically what broadcast seeding does is it lays that seed across the top of the ground, and then the natural frost, kind of the heaving of the soil as the frost leaves and comes back into the ground on maybe a daily or kind of a every other day basis, kind of in that late February, early March timeframe, can actually help work that soil into the ground. And that's why things like clover do really well with broadcast seeding. Okay. All right, so basically our ultimate goal for seeding is to uniformly distribute the correct amount of seed needed and to hopefully cover the seed with only about 1/4 of an inch of soil. That's not a lot of soil when you really think about it. But basically we want to form a firm contact between that seed and that soil to get it to grow. If you have that seed too close to the surface, it can dry out. If you have it too deep, that seed, when it germinates, has only so much energy stored in it. So it needs to be able to break through that soil surface and start collecting that sunlight quickly. Otherwise, it'll just lay dormant in the soil if it takes too long because it has to travel too far to get to that soil or that surface. Okay. All right, so this is one example of kind of a seeding method. This is called a cultipacker seeder, or you may also hear it referred to as a brilliant seeder. This is a great method for obtaining really good seed to soil contact. A lot of university studies will use a brilliant seeder just because you can get them in kind of almost even like push varieties, hand versions. And it just provides great seed to soil contact. You can see here we have our seed boxes up top. They come down the seed tubes, and then right as that seed goes into the ground, you have the cultipacker that comes behind and helps push that seed in just the right amount. All right. All right, the next is a band seeder. So this may be used on a lot larger fields, maybe out west in places like that, where you're covering a lot larger amount of ground. So basically we're extending the seed tubes of a small seed attachment on the grain drill to within about 2 to 4 inches of that soil surface. So we're getting it right down there to the surface. So the seed will fall directly into a band that's over kind of fertilizer that was placed into the ground at the same time. So that's great as well, because that seed gets that extra fertilizer, that boost that it needs to kind of give it that burst when it first germinates. All right. And then we have pretty much what everybody has out there, just your basic grain drill. So an unmodified grain drill can be used for planting a lot of our grasses and legumes. So it's not quite as effective as the other methods above because it doesn't get it directly into the soil or directly in contact with the soil, not as uniformly or as neatly, but it still works great. When you look at a grain drill, that seed has to drop maybe just a little bit farther to the ground. There's not always something that's like a cultipacker that's coming behind it to ensure that seed to soil contact. But a grain drill is still a good method to use if it's the option that you have. So nothing against it. It's just not quite as effective as a brilliant / cultipacker seeder or yeah, the other one that we just talked about. All right, and then like we said, the other option could be broadcast seeding. So this is really great for really hilly or rough ground maybe. So maybe those of you that are more in southern Indiana or maybe the boot hills of Missouri, places like that where it's a little tougher to get equipment into safely, we'll put it that way. You can actually have broadcast seeders on ATVs, UTVs, things like that, that might be a little handier than a tractor. But there are also really great handheld models that we can see here in the picture on the right where the gentleman is walking the seed on. Might be a little bit more manual labor, a lot more manual labor, but this way you know, you can kind of count your steps, you know how much seed you should be putting on, things like that. So again, the broadcast seeding works really well for that February, early March timeframe when we're putting clover out. And a few other maybe perennial grasses does not work at all for alfalfa or some of our annual species. All right. And then we have the no-till planting option as well. So this is where we plant grasses or legumes into that existing sod or legume stand. So this would be really well used in a renovation situation. So basically we still have forage that's growing. So it says here we need to have our vegetation either killed or suppressed to allow for that seeding establishment. So suppressed is basically like we talked about where you graze it down to a lot lower height to maybe only 2 inches instead of leaving 4 inches. So that way you have a lot less basically competition. So when that seed comes up, it can get to the sun faster. it doesn't have to get through a thicker canopy versus if it was still about 4 inches of height of forage. All right, so spring seedings are preferred, usually because there's better moisture in the soil, so it makes it a lot easier for that seed to come up quickly.
Okay. One thing I do want to interject here as well is we talked about a few different options of how to plant. There's also new ideas and new concepts coming on the market every year. I know there's some double rolling baskets out there that have a cover crop seeder attachment that you can put on with them or put with them. And other implement manufacturers are also coming out with new ideas and new ways to help plant forages as well. So make sure you talk to your local either equipment manufacturer or soil and water to kind of find out what's best for your area.
Great. Thank you, Matthias. All right. So now we're going to kind of go through a few of those steps on how to kind of help calibrate a drill for seeding. Just because basically to calibrate is to basically measure out a certain amount to make sure that what that machinery is spitting out is what the seed tag recommends should be planted. So this is just a short little diagram of kind of what a drill kind of basic function looks like. So we have here towards the top, we have our seed hopper boxes. So this is where you'll dump in your seeds. So large hopper box, usually it'll be kind of some of our larger seeds. So things like some of our clovers or some of our grasses. And then the small seed hopper box could be things like alfalfa, something like some of our annual grasses. So things like teff. Teff is incredibly small, really, really small. So it'd probably go in that small seed hopper box. Then below our boxes, we have usually a seed metering device that kind of counts the number of seeds that needs to come out at one time. And this is where you make some of your adjustments when calibrating, just so you don't have a huge rush of seeds coming out or only a few or only like one, just so you can kind of adjust that measurement. Then we have our drop tubes that come down from that seed hopper box that gets it down closer to the ground. And from there, we have things like our coulters that kind of open up a little bit of an opening for that seed to drop into. And then here in the back on the left-hand side, we have our press wheel. So that's where basically we have the opening, the seed comes into that opening, and the press wheel comes in behind and presses that opening back closed. So that's kind of the basic function of a drill. All right. All right, so how do we calibrate our drill? This may seem a little scary, may seem like a lot, but really, it's really important to have this done. Even if you're borrowing a drill from somebody or your next door neighbor is coming over to do it for you, please make sure that the drill is calibrated to the seed and to the amount that you want planted. Because to have to go over the field again because you didn't get enough field out there, you're having extra compaction on that field, which can lead to issues. Or if it's not calibrated correctly and you put too much seed on, you're going to have to spend more money to finish up planting that field. So make sure that it is properly calibrated to the seed amount that you need. So the basic things that you'll need to calibrate will be just a container to catch the seed. Plastic containers. You can always go in your kitchen because I know everybody just like me has those containers that no lid will match. Those will work perfectly for this. You'll need a tape measure to determine the circumference of that drive wheel. So kind of the measurement of kind of how many a rotation of that wheel basically lets kind of that seed meter know when it needs to drop seed. So you need to know that circumference and the disc opener space. You'll need flags to mark your stopping and starting parts for in-field calibration because you need to go so many feet to work on calculations. If you're going to be doing this in a shop, you'll need a floor or bottle jack to make sure that the equipment is up off the ground and not going to go anywhere. And then you'll want a scale that will come within 1/10 of a gram accuracy to properly get the weight needed to perform your calibration to make sure you have the right amount of seed coming out. Okay? All right. All right, so like I said, don't make a mistake, calibrate. So biggest thing, I know this is gonna be hard for some gentlemen, but you need to read your drill's operator manual. Unless you're like my husband and he loves to collect the manuals, even for equipment we don't have, just because he thinks it's fun. So just make sure that you're reading that manual, you know how to operate and how to properly calibrate the equipment as well. You want to make sure your seed tubes are not blocked. Dr. Johnson at Purdue, who's our forage specialist, has a great story about a beautiful field that he had planted as a research study. 2 weeks later, they went back to look at it, and there were very distinct missed rows. They went back to look at their planter, and they had a spider nest, just a small little spider nest built in one of those tubes, enough to block the seeds from coming down that tube. So you want to make sure the tubes are cleaned out. You can use a vacuum and air hose, things like that, or even send a rag down it. Just make sure they're cleaned out. And then use the seeding rate chart to kind of set the drill. This should be found on your drill. Usually if you open up the seed box lid, it's usually right there. If it's not there, you could probably Google it as well. There's plenty of resources out there to find that seeding rate chart to go along with your drill. And then again, select the proper gearbox setting or drive gear. So making sure, like we said, that kind of that seed meter, making sure you kind of calibrate it to what you think the box says it should be to start with, instead of just kind of starting at the lowest setting and going to the highest. Kind of start where the box suggests and go from there. And then place a small amount of the seed you intend to use above the opening, basically in the seed box of the drill. Kind of each drill box, just so you can kind of get a good collection of several seed tubes instead of just one, to make sure you have a good flow throughout the whole drill. Okay. All right, next we're going to go ahead and lower the drill to kind of engage the seeding mechanism, because as it's up in the air, it's not going to let the seed flow. But this is where you can have the bottle jack and manually move that drive wheel yourself. And that's where you need to know how the circumference, so you know how many feet it would basically mimic moving in the field. So you want to make sure that seeding mechanism gets turned until seed comes out. And then at that point, you're going to go ahead and disconnect about 3 to 5 of the seed tubes. You don't need to collect from everyone, but just about 3 to 5 of the seed tubes. And then you can put a Ziploc baggie on those seed tubes if you're moving through the field itself, or if you're going to be just in the shop doing it. This is where you can put the Tupperware containers underneath it. So you're going to want to pull the drill for about 150 feet, not about 150 feet, as exact as you can get, or turn the drive wheel the number of times to equal 150 feet. So this is a little equation here to figure that out. So your number of revolutions to turn that drive wheel is going to be equal to 150 divided by pi times the diameter of that drive wheel. So that's why we needed the tape measure earlier. Okay. All right, and so once you've gone the 150 feet, you can carefully remove the collection containers, whether it's that Ziploc baggie on the seed tube or the containers on the ground. And you want to place an empty container on the scale to use the tare button, because you might not think it, but a Ziploc baggie weighs a little bit, and that can actually throw off your measurements. And then you want to weigh each of those containers. Don't dump them together, because if there's one of those tubes that's not acting right, you want to know it. So weigh each filled seed container. Then you can add them together and divide by the number of seed tubes that you had. So if you used 4 seed tubes, you would take, let's say we collected 10 pounds, You divide by 4, you'd get 2.5 pounds average weight per disc opener. And so then you just go back and compare that average weight to grams of seed found on that provided table on the disc, or what we'll show you next. All right, so this is actually from Kentucky Forage News. So they have a great publication, a really great video explaining how to calibrate. But this basically looks at kind of what those grams of seed per opener should be catching in that 150 feet, depending on how many pounds per acre you want to be planting. So if your distance between your disc openers, let's say, is 7 inches, so that's going to be the second row here, and you want to be planting 14 pounds per acre. So we'll go down here on the left, we'll find our 7, and then we'll go across and find our 14 column. So we should have collected 12.8 grams of seed per disc opener. You really want to stay within 10% of that number. So you could go above to about 14 or below to about 11.6 grams and still be okay. If you're getting outside of that 10% range, that's when you'll need to kind of tweak that seed meter, your calibration, and that's where you kind of tweak it a little bit, adjust it to get closer to that desired amount. Okay. All right, and then just a few words of caution, kind of as we kind of close out this topic here. Biggest thing you want to be concerned with when renovating pastures especially is alfalfa toxicity. So if you've had alfalfa in that pasture actively growing, imagine putting a 55-gallon drum over that alfalfa plant. Alfalfa naturally produces a toxin, and so it basically prevents new alfalfa plants from growing for quite a while after that plant has died, or while it's still actively living. So if you're going in and trying to no-till drill into the soil alfalfa, into a standing grass alfalfa field, you're not going to get the germination that you really want to see. What you want is, if you're planting back into an alfalfa field, you'll need to go in at least 6 months in advance. Some people say 6 weeks. I like to give it a little bit longer, and basically 6 months in advance and completely kill out that field. So using whatever sprays you want to, things like that, and completely kill it out. Now you can go in and plant something like a summer annual into that field to still have some green coverage, but you don't want alfalfa into it. And then, so you do that in the spring, do kind of a summer annual, and then come in the fall, and that's when you could plant your alfalfa in without concern of that toxicity affecting your germination rate. All right, and then your seeding year management. Seeding year management really depends on whether a companion crop, weeds, insects, or disease are present. So basically you're looking at, is there something in that field that's going to compete with my seed to provide it the nutrients, the water, and the sunlight that it needs? So if weeds develop to where it would basically smother out that new plant, you're going to want to cut low to kind of kill those weeds like we talked about beforehand. So either doing it in the spring, kind of grazing it down a little bit harshly to start with so you don't have a lot of growth, things like that, or kind of using spray if you need to. And then again, do not harvest in a 6-week period prior to the first killing frost. This goes along for whether you're grazing or if you are out, scratch that comment. So mostly that's just for hay production. So if you plan on making some hay off that field to start with, you want to make sure you give it a rest before that killing frost, because again, we want that energy collected through the leaves to be stored in that root to get it over the winter. If you're grazing, you want to be kind of a little cautious in terms of grazing right up to a killing frost, because again, those plants that are nubbed down even to 4 inches and you get a killing frost on it, basically what that grazing does is it kind of stalls out that energy reserve in those roots. So it makes it harder for that plant to get started again and get growing in the spring if it doesn't have a lot of good energy in those roots. Okay. And then whether dealing with high management, whether alfalfa or lower management, something like a tall fescue. So your perennial forages, a really successful establishment phase is essential to kind of that long-lived productive stand. So you want to get that soil test like we've talked about quite a bit. So getting that good solid soil test done to start with. If you take nothing else away, that would be the biggest thing to take away. Get a soil test done before you even start looking at seed even. Just so you get that good start, that good healthy soil for that seed to then go into. And then following these other recommendations, calibrating, making sure you have seed that's suitable for your soil and for your end goal of raising your animals on that forage. All right. All right, and so with that, do you have any other words of wisdom you'd like to add, Matthias?
I think you've said it a couple times, soil test, soil test, soil test. But with that, if you need help interpreting these soil tests, contact your local extension office. We can help you interpret these soil tests. Sometimes when you get these soil tests back, it looks like just numbers on a page. But we are able to go in and go, okay, so you got enough potassium, maybe you need a little extra nitrogen, or while you're planting alfalfa, so nitrogen may not be the most prevalent thing that you need. So just kind of know and be willing to talk to somebody about where your weaknesses are at with interpreting the soil test. We're here to help.
All right, thank you. All right, so with that, we'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
I've got one for you, Elysia.
Okay.
So going back to the establishment of pastures here, where can we find some good information on, I know I want to put a pasture in this 10 acres here. What good practices or what good types of forages would be good for that 10 acres?
Yep. So like we talked about, it really depends on looking at your soil. So what soil do you have? Your farm is not just mostly is not going to have just one type of soil. A lot of our farms, even just being down to, I've got a 5-acre farm. No, it's 7 acres now, excuse me. We got a couple extra acres. So our 7-acre farm, we have 3 or 4 different types of soil on our farm. That can really make a difference in terms of the types of seed that prefers to grow in different areas. Also, you need to think of kind of your rotation on your pastures. So do you want to have the ability to get in there to make hay possibly? Or do you want all permanent fencing to where it's going to be much less movable or flexible if need be? If you want that flexibility, then fence in the exterior and then maybe create a couple of kind of smaller paddocks from there. So maybe you break it down into 5-acre fields and then use temporary setups from there. So you need to kind of look at what your thoughts are. How are you going to utilize that field? And then also, again, raising the sheep and the goats. Luckily with sheep and goats, we can put a few more head per acre on that land than if we were raising cattle. So you can kind of look at how many animals are you looking at grazing and kind of look at kind of partitioning off how many paddocks can we create with the forage we intend to grow. So there's a lot of thought that goes into, okay, I bought this farm, we have 10 acres, this is what's out there, I want to grow animals, what can I do? So there's a lot of questions that go into it. We need to look at what's there, if it's suitable for the animals that you want to raise, so our sheep and our goats, or do we need to look at kind of renovating those pastures to forage species that better suit their palates?
And then where can I find what type of
yeah.
soils on my farm?
Yep. So you can find what types of soils are on your farm by visiting Web Soil Survey, and I'll type that into the chat box. It's a online tool, and you can go in there, and there's a big blue button at the top right corner that says Start WSS. So you click on that, you enter in your address, and you kind of define your search area, and it tells you what those soils are, tells you absolutely everything you want to know about it. Can you grow trees? Is it good for a septic site? Is it good for a housing site? Is it good for playgrounds? Is it good for pastures? All sorts of fun information. If you need help figuring it out, many of us in the extension offices are more than happy to help you kind of maneuver through it. Another great resource when you're looking at forages, looking at the different types, potentially diseases, things like that that can come up, looking at fertilizer, is the Forage Field Guide from Purdue. I think it's $9 or $10. It's a little pocket guide, but it's full, chock full of all sorts of really good information.